hopefully will be able to refresh your memory of a few things pertinent to using the requirement change exception, and maybe share a few new things as well. So the first thing that I'm going to do in setting up our presentation today is I'm going to, just like I did for Course Directed, show you how you can avoid timing out when you're writing exceptions. I know some of you have been probably trying to work from two screens and have been using your portal tabs across the top here. The portal tabs are really nice because they can take a lot of information that's hidden in the background of the system and bring it forward to you, put it in one convenient place. But the problem with the portal tabs is that if you're using multiple windows to try and do actions in two different pages, the portal doesn't see you as doing those actions in two separate locations. And the system actually times you out on the page that you are not using present. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how you can be working in both the exceptions page and also be in the Advisor Center so that you can be writing exceptions and running degree audits and not having to worry about the system timing you out as you bounce back and forth between those two pages. So up at the top of your screen here, you have what we call the breadcrumbs. And these are the easiest way for you to access some of the pages that you'll need to go to without having that timeout issue. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Main Menu, and I'm going to go to Campus Solutions, Academic Advisement, Student Advisement, and then Authorized Student Exceptions. That's going to take me to the main page where I can either search for exceptions or I can create new exceptions by adding a new value. Then I'm going to go up here to the top right-hand corner. I'm going to click on New Window in order to open up a new Catalyst tab. And then I'm going to follow the breadcrumbs again to go to the Advisor Center. So I'm going to go Main Menu. And when you see me click this little set of arrows here in the sort of the top right-hand portion of this drop-down, what I'm doing is I'm alphabetizing entries under Campus Solutions. You can see those are on alphabetical order now. So I'm going to go Main Menu, Campus Solutions, Self-Service, go to the Advisor Center, and then I can really click any of these first 5 entries here. I'm going to go ahead and click on General Info, and it's going to take me to the same search screen that I would have got if I clicked on any of the other options. You can see My Advisees. It's going to launch me to a page where if I had any advisees, I could click on them just in that space. If I go to Advisee Student Center, I'm back on the search page, General Info, Transfer Credit. All of those are going to take you to that same spot, as will Advisee Academics. So from the Student Center, I'm going to go ahead and bring up a student that I want to work with for our demo. So I'm going to go ahead and type their information in. In this case, I don't have their EMPL ID offhand, so I'm just going to search by their name and locate the student that I want to work with and bring up their entry in the Student Center. So once I have this up, the first thing that you're going to do, I'm going to try and simulate this the same way that an advisor would experience the need to write this type of exception. Is the first thing that you're probably going to do is run the audit. So academic requirements, from the academics drop-down, it's going to run the student's default audit, and it's going to go ahead and bring that information up. I always recommend going through and running the audit first before you try to write an exception. Even if you know that you're going to eventually go in and make some exceptions for the student, you might already know where you're going to do that. But particularly with requirement change, it's important that you run the audit first so that you can gain a sense of at what level you need to be making the requirement change at. So a bit of information to kind of set this up for you. If I'm looking at the student's audit, perhaps I notice in running the audit that under English composition, the student still has the intermediate composition that they're going to complete. And maybe I've already met with the student and they've told me that they're going to transfer in the course, but the course is going to come in for less than the required number of hours. Maybe they know their transfer course is only going to be worth 2 hours instead of the required 3. Or maybe in their core here, maybe I'm keen to say Econ 1002 is the only course that they need to take. So we're going to work with this space right here to start, pre-business administration. It's a core. I'm going to look and see what the parameter values tell me about what the student has done and what the student needs to do in order to satisfy this portion of the audit. Right now, what I'm reading across this parameter is that the overall requirement for pre-business administration, this line, is set to look for 21 units or credit hours of coursework for the student. The student has completed 3 hours towards satisfying that requirement, and the student still needs 18 more hours in order to complete the pre-business administration core in this program. So I've located in my audit where I want to make the change to. I've noticed that in this particular case, the space I want to make the change to is right next to this little green drop-down arrow. And it's not in any kind of header. It's not in this light gray like what we see here. It's not in the dark black that we saw in the beginning. And that's important to note. The space depicted by this dark black banner is what we would call a requirement group. So that's the component that's built in the audit system that shows this space. The requirement group contains everything that you see under it, but it's broken down into smaller groupings. So the things that you see in sort of the light gray banner are called requirements. And the things that you see with the green arrows next to them under the requirements are called requirement lines. Now, I make note of this because when making a requirement change, you're going to have to indicate the level that you're going to make this change at. So after running the audit, we can see that we would want to make this particular type of change at the requirement line level. And so armed with that sort of information, the only other thing that we would need to know in order to successfully make this particular type of exception is we need to know what the plan code and the program is for pre-business administration. So one of the places that we can go to find that CPP stack information is we can click on the Academics tab here in our Advisor Center, and it'll bring up the student's CPP stack history. We can kind of click through this. We can note on the status which of these programs is the active program, and we can also see the title of the program listed out next to plan. So pre-business administration is what we were looking for, PBA 34AA. That gives us all the information that we would need to know in order to be able to create a requirement change exception. So now we're able to go over to the Authorized Student Exceptions tab. And in this case, we're going to be creating a new value because we want to create a new exception for the student. So if we click Add a New Value, we're going to see the advisement override number populated here. It's all zeros. Anytime you see something in the system like you learned at your degree audit training or your advisor management training, anytime you see something in the system that has all zeros or says new, you're going to want to leave that alone because what that means is it's a system-generated number, and it's just going to make it the next number available in the system. So it's keeping a running total of all of the exceptions that have been created. Your exception is going to be provided the next possible number, and all we have to do to see that happen is click Add. It's still going to say all zeros here, but now we're in a space where we can create the exception. And once we're done creating our exception, we're going to click Save, and all of a sudden that assessment and that advisement override number is going to get populated at the top. So just like with requirement change or waiver, an override exception, or a course directive, you're always going to have to populate the first of 2 pages in order to tell the system some very important information about what program you would like this exception to apply to. So if you look at the fields across the top, you have an effective date. The effective date tells the system when this exception should become valid in the degree audit system for. So if you are looking at the default date, it's always going to be today's date because the assumption that Catalyst is making is that you're creating an exception that you'd like to be immediately valid and immediately available in the degree audit system. So we want that to be the case too. We're going to go ahead and leave that alone. If we didn't want it to be the case, if we were proactively making exceptions for a student and they didn't take place or didn't need to be in the audit system until a particular point in time, you are able to future date or backdate your exception based on this effective date here. You have a status across the top. The status tells you whether the whether the exception is active or inactive as of the effective date that you see. If you ever make a mistake in creating an exception and you want to keep some history, or if you have some criterion that the student needed to live up to in order for the exception to remain valid and they didn't, you wanted to keep the history of the exception, you could simply mark the status as inactive, and once you do that and save it, the exception is going to stop processing in the audit. So for our example, we want it to be active because we want the exception to take place immediately in the audit, and we want it to be something that's processing in the audit. Your description is a search description, so it's nothing that the student is going to see in this instance. It's going to be something that if you're writing multiple exceptions for a student, you're going to want to take some careful time in thinking about some kind of system of naming so that you'll be able to find this exception from other exceptions that you've written for the student rather quickly when you go to search for it. In this case, I'm going to say requirement change, pre-business 4. You have a limited number of characters, so you can see as I try to type all that in, it kind of stopped me a little bit early. You have 36 total characters to work with there. In the long description, you are going to be putting in a value that is going to be seen by the student. It's going to be displayed in the audit. So as a general rule of thumb, the more clear that you can be about what exactly the exception is meaning to do, the better it is, because not only will you be able to read this description and get sort of your memory refreshed about why it was created, but the student is going to be able to see it in their web-based version of the audit if the requirement is not completed. And it's going to also be able to see it on the PDF regardless of whether the requirement has been completed or not. So it's going to give them, as they're looking at those documents, a reference as to why that exception was created. So in this case, I'm going to say, reduce the number of core hours to 5. Okay, the next bit of information that you need to complete is you need to identify for the system the CPP stack that you'd like this exception to apply to. And the reason why you have to fill in this information is because unlike in our previous system, Darwin, in the Catalyst degree audit system, we're able to create degree audit reports that contain all of the students' programs that they have declared under each career in the same report. So if a student has a 4-year program declared and a minor and a certificate, you're going to see all those programs in the same audit, and it's going to be important for you to be able to depict in your exception of those 3 programs which one of these programs should this exception apply to. So a little trick when creating your override details, when defining your CPP stack here, is that you can just skip down to the plan level if you want, and you can begin typing in information about your plan. It's going to try and match against what exists in the plan table, so it's going to bring up options here. And if you find the one that you want, you can just click on it, or if you finish typing before it finds it, you can click on it. And then once you go to the next tab, it's going to go ahead and populate the career and program associated with that plan already for you. So if you're writing a lot of exceptions, you know, it's maybe not a huge saver of time, but it does save you a little bit of time as you go along. You can't actually do that at the subplan level. So at the lowest level of the CPP stack for your student and the program that you're working with is subplan, you're going to need to fill in plan, and then you can use your search window, and it will show you if there are any subplans associated. You can pick any of those, or you can just type directly into the subplan box, and it'll go ahead and populate it. So the next thing I need is I need a student ID. You get to pick from a selection code and selection data. The selection code options are student, academic program, primary academic plan, and student group. We always advocate for just making exception changes at the student level. And the reason why we do that is because if you're choosing something like academic program, you're deciding to make this change for everybody in a plan or a subplan that exists under a particular academic program. Or you're making this change if you pick primary academic plan for everybody that is in that plan. And that's a really heavy-handed way to change audits we would say in any instance that you need sort of that broad type of change, contact your assigned encoder and they'll be able to do that for you. And it's a little bit safer of a way to do it because you know the encoder is going to be able to impact that change, or bring that change into the audit to impact the audits for all the students that you are trying to get to and nobody else. Sometimes we see academic program and academic plan selected when we periodically review exceptions, and what ends up happening is, you know, somebody meant to make an exception for a particular student or somebody meant to make an exception for a particular plan, and instead they wiped out all of a requirement or changed values for all of the students in like a particular college or something at that level, which is usually not the intended outcome. So if you pick selection code of student, then you're going to need to supply the IMPL ID as the selection data. If you pick anything else, if you pick program or plan or student group, you're going to have to provide either the program, the plan, or the student group as your selection data. So that's kind of a way to check and make sure that you don't accidentally select that one of those other values erroneously anyways. If you're trying to fill out this information and you think you're going to be making this for a student and you pick the wrong selection code, when you enter in the IMPL ID as the selection data, it's going to tell you that's an invalid value. So that'll be a way to double check and make sure that you're always getting a selection code of student. So I don't remember the IMPL ID associated with my student. One of the ways that I can go to get that is I can click back over to my advisor center here and scroll to the bottom of my page and tell it to return to search. And there is the ID of the student that I need right there in the search window. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that, switch over to my exception again, and paste that into the selection data. So now I have one field left to fill out on the first page of the authorized student exception for my requirement change. And this is where I'm actually selecting the type of exception that I'd like to make. So you have course directive, requirement change, override, waiver. Typically course directive allows for you to add or remove courses from a requirement. Requirement change allows for you to reduce or increase the number of hours or courses required for a particular space in the audit. You can also eliminate GPA requirements or minimum GPA requirements, or you can add those to a specific student. Requirement override allows for you to swap out an existing requirement in the audit for something that has been specifically designed by your encoder. And requirement waiver allows for you to eliminate all of the parameter values associated with space in the audit, to completely waive a requirement or a requirement line for the student. So requirement change is what we're looking for. It's going to allow for us to reduce the amount or increase the amount of a parameter value on the requirement, or on the requirement line, or on the group. So when we select requirement change, the next thing the system wants to know is at what level would you like to make that change at? And from our example before, we said we're going to select requirement line level. So we can just click the magnifying glass next to our field here for level and select requirement line. Now we have the first page of the exception filled in. We can click the hyperlink for create exception, and that's going to take us to the second page. The second page is a page where we're just going to need two important pieces of information. The first set of fields that you see are under the requirement line to change header, and this is where we are indicating where in the audit we'd like to make the change. So if we go back to our audit here for the student, and we scroll down, we notice that our core requirement that we're interested in, pre-business administration core, our line, lives under the pre-business administration requirement. So as we look at our exception, we can go to our group. Our group is basically the equivalent of program, and these results are populated based on the CPP stack that you indicated on the first tab. So in most cases, you're only going to see one group here. This is the group for pre-business administration in College 34. We can go down then to the requirement level, and we can try to find from the descriptions the core requirement that we're looking for. So 34 PDA core, in this case, is the one that we want. And then we're going to find the line number that we need. Now, typically speaking, if you just count the number of lines, you're probably going to get the right line that you want if you count by tens. So line 1 would be line 10, line 2 would be line 20, and line 3 would be line 30. That isn't always the case because we do occasionally have some hidden lines and we have some limit lines that process behind the scenes, but we're very clear about how we label those lines for you here so that you won't accidentally choose one of those. But in our case, there's only 3 lines. You can see that 10, 20, 30 is our PBA core, and that was what we were hoping to make our requirement change for. So we're just going to go ahead and select that. When you select your requirement group and your requirement and your line number, if you're going down to the line level, it's going to go ahead and it's going to populate all of the parameter values associated with that line as the encoder has created them in the new values column. From that point, you are able to manipulate this value as much as you want. And there could be, min units values or maximum units values, minimum course values or maximum course values. We said in our detail that we were going to make the minimum units for this requirement 5. So we're just going to go ahead and replace the number 21 with 5 and click OK. When we do that, what we're telling the system is that at the location that we have found that we want to make this change to, we are no longer going to be looking for 21 hours, but we're going to be looking for 5 hours. So I'm going to go ahead and save my exception. I'm going to click back over to my Student Center tab, and I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and just click Cancel to get out of that audit. So once your exception is made, you do need to run a new audit in order to be able to see the exception process in. And I'm going to go ahead and just do that really quickly. I'm going to scroll back down to our pre-business administration space here, our requirement for pre-business administration. And I'm going to look down to the 3rd line to see that some change has occurred. I can see that there's a note on the web-based version that says the required units or courses have been changed for this requirement line. And I can see now in my parameter values that are displayed that our change has taken effect. So this used to be 21 hours required. Now we see that it's only 5 hours required. 3 of those hours are still taken, and now only 2 are needed. If I want to see the description behind the exception that I wrote, I can click on this hyperlinked note here, and it's going to take me in not only to show me the description, but it's going to show me how the parameters have changed. So it's going to show me the old value, the original value in the audit, and it's also going to show me the new value that we've indicated in our exception. So that's a fairly quick change that you can do in the audit that's going to have some impact for the student. I said before, as long as this requirement on the web is not satisfied, you're still going to see this note here. When this requirement becomes satisfied, this note is going to go away on the web, because on the web the system seeks to kind of save space where it can. So to illustrate that, I'm going to go into my exception again, and I'm going to make a quick change just to take this down to 3 hours, which is the number that the student has completed. And I'm going to save it again, and then I'm going to go rerun the audit. And when I rerun the audit, you'll notice that that line is now satisfied. And if I open the line up, you can no longer see the note here. You can, however, still see the note if you click on the PDF version of the report. So I'm going to click on the PDF here. I'm going to make sure that my pop-up blocker will allow this to go through. If you ever click on the PDF and it doesn't go through, just make sure that you set your pop-up blocker to accept pop-ups from Catalyst, and then it will come through. So if I scroll down here to the 3rd line, pre-business administration, I can see even though it's satisfied on the PDF version of the audit, I still get the note that the requirement was changed. It tells me how the requirement was changed in the 2nd line, and it gives me my detail that I typed into the exception with the 3rd line. So it's always going to be something that's out there for the students to see, depending on how they choose to view the audit. And so it's important that you have, like a good description to go with the exception that you're writing. Now, there are a few things to keep in mind when you're writing, in addition to just the basics about requirement change. The first is when you're defining these fields on the second portion of your exception, the new values fields are all numeric fields. So one thing you cannot do with a requirement change is you cannot eliminate all of the hours associated with a particular space in the audit. In this case, we were able to get the student to satisfy, but we did still leave hours here for the students to need to complete. It just so happened that they had already completed them in this case. But I could not change this value to a 0 because it doesn't consider 0 to be a valid entry here. If I try to do that, it's just going to blank that out and no change is going to happen in the audit. So even though it allowed me to take it, if I go back into my exception now, I can see that it just eliminated 0 as a possibility, and now nothing is occurring based on the structure that I've set up in my exception. So if the desired result is to eliminate the entire set of parameters associated with space in the audit, you're going to want to do a requirement waiver and not a requirement change. So requirement change is just going to let you to move the values up or down, but not completely down. So in this case, maybe the idea is that this student, for another example, this student maybe got some hours waived somewhere else in the audit, and the exchange was that to waive those hours, you would need to increase the core. So we did have 21 hours that were here originally when we picked PBA core, and now we're going to push it up to, say, 24 hours. Let's say they had to take an additional course. So we say, OK, and we save that. We can go back over to our degree audit here, and we can run the audit again. When we do that and go down to the PBA, now we see that the units have been increased from 21 to 24. When we click on our note, we can see the increase here as well. So requirement change is probably most commonly used to reduce the value on a particular space in the audit, but also can be used to increase the number of units that you're looking for in a particular space in the audit as well. So the last thing that I want to show you with requirement change would have to do with like a minimum GPA value. So if there was a minimum GPA value that existed on this requirement, you would see it in the parameters. Unfortunately, I don't know that this is going to be a good example. We can use this business analytics space here in order to further illustrate, I guess, how you can make combinations. This first example that we did only had one parameter value associated with it, but you could utilize requirement change to change multiple aspects of the audit at the same time. So if you're looking at this space under business analytics, the first line that looks for this BA NA 2081 course has both units and course values. If we go and we find that space, we want to make a change to it, we can find our line. It shows you all of the different things that are occurring at this level. There's a minimum number of units that the student needs, there's a minimum number of courses, and there's a maximum number of units that are allowed for the student. So in a lot of cases, we have like a maximum units value when we're concerned that the student is going to get multiple courses in a space that they shouldn't. The downside to that is occasionally the maximum value will stop courses from getting into a space that they potentially should. If you find that to be the case, it's always safe to be able to contact your encoder, and they'll be able to look through it and determine if that's the case. If it comes back in your conversation that it really is something that should just be changed for this particular student, you could go ahead and you could eliminate that value altogether. Now, eliminating this maximum units value is different than changing one of these minimum values to 0, because the system doesn't require that you have a max value in place. The system only requires that you have minimum values. So we could really make some changes here, all in one exception to this particular space in the audit. We could get rid of the max, we could increase the number of units, and we could potentially increase the number of courses, just as I've done here. We'll go ahead and click OK and save it. And now, if we rerun the audit, we'll notice that all three of those things have changed. So I'll scroll down here to Business Analytics. We can see that there's an increase in units, there's an increase in courses. The max value is never listed for the students to see on the web, so you don't see that. But if you do go ahead and click in, you can see how these minimum units are impacted in your requirement. The only place that you'd be able to go in and see that that max value has been impacted is you'd have to go back to your exception. And when you get here, you would see that there are no max units that are listed now, and that means that there is no max operating on this particular line, which is useful to see. Now, the last thing that I want to show you, and I'm going to copy the student simple ID for this, is if you were trying to get back to an exception after you created it. So you created a number of requirement changes for a student, and you needed to go back and find those things. When you're on the Authorized Student Exceptions page, you can use the selection data field, put in the student simple ID, and click search, and it will take you directly to the exception if the student only has one exception that's been created for them, or if there are multiple exceptions, it'll list them all out for you in order. So those are sort of the key functions of the requirement change. I'm going to go ahead and pause for a second so that we can get some questions together, and we'll go ahead and run through those questions.